We're going as far as, okay. So. Oh, wait, too soon. Sure, there we go. So what we're going to explore this week, this is not really an avenue to proving God exists, but it's asking the question, well, what if God does not exist? This does that every time. Let's see.
Oh, my mom's in my hometown and my dad's at home and he doesn't know how to work the computer. That's why.
That's all right. They don't need to know about God. So, good morning, Pop. So, this is more, there's a couple ways to approach apologetics, and one of them is get people to realize what their assumptions are and the repercussions of those. And this is the first one. And we live in an age which cavalierly denounces God or says he doesn't exist, and they don't think through the repercussions of that. And that's what we're going to look at some today. If God doesn't exist, then all life eventually dies. We all are mortal, because if there's no God, there's no immortality without a God. Okay, you got to have a God to have immortality, because everything around us says you die. But not only do we die, the universe is going to die. We all know this, right? That if there's no God, or even if there is a God, if he doesn't intervene, the universe is going to die, because everything's expanding, continues to expand. It's not static. It's going to cool off, and it will just become a lifeless scattering. But that's obviously well into the future. Just a few, at least, 2028 after the next election. But this, people don't think that through. Now, if you watch like the Cosmos or any of those specials on science, they'll talk about the cold, lifeless place that this is, and the universe is indifferent, da 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 da. If there's no God, there's no immortality, and life itself has no objective meaning, value, or purpose. That's the first thing we're going through. So what we're doing is, if you're saying God doesn't exist, what's that world like? Let's talk about that and think about the repercussions. Now, if you read the New Atheist, anybody in here ever read Richard Dawkins or hear him or any of these guys? They're not as popular now because their positions were so stupid. But if you read physicists, they still talk this way. Some of them, not all of them. And thinking through, we've all know who Soren Kierkegaard is, Camus, and the existentialists of the 40s and 50s. Jean-Paul Sartre. He wrote No Exit. Remember that play? You're all looking at me like you read it in high school, and it was one of those.
No exits.
Noexit.
I didn't read that in high school.
Yeah, you did. It's a short little play. It's about the absurdity and uselessness. We know you of life. And the existentialists are well aware of the absurdity of life, and they pound this. And the interesting thing is, what do you do with that? So look, if there's no God and or immortality, so it's a two-pronged thing. If you don't live forever, what's the point? Well, you can live for 80 years. Well, when you're 79 and a half, that 80 years doesn't seem so long. I'm 65 in July. Average, what's life expectancy for a man in this country? 76 now, 72, 76, somewhere in there. Well, that's a finite space of time. It's not far off into the distance. And so, But even if you live forever, that doesn't solve everything. You need a God. So let's talk about it. He talks about it in terms of meaning. If there's no God or immortality, then meaning gets deprived. So let's talk about the immortality part first. Yeah, however long you live, you're just not going to make a difference. There's no significance to your life. Wait, but I did this. I've written books, they're in the library, and they'll disappear in 10 years or 100 years even. But that goes. I mean, Blaise Pascal wrote in the 1600s. His book is still around, but there's very few of those that are like that. And it doesn't, there's no significance if you die. But even if you don't die, without God, there's no meaning. There's a play. There's a H.G. Wells or somebody else, a science fiction story, where a guy is on a moon and he's stranded there. He can breathe, but he's got two vials. One says you'll live forever, one says you'll die. And one's suicide, one's live forever. And he goes, I don't want to live like this forever. So he drinks the suicide thing, only to have made a mistake. And he's drunk the immortality one. And now he's stuck with no meaning. So even though he's immortal, life has some meaning. God is what does it. It's our, I need a Kleenex. Do we have one? Oh, they're back there. Thank you, Matthew Buck. How does God give us significance? Let's just address that meaning.
The purpose to
Well, we're going to talk about purpose in a minute.
fulfill his will.
Okay, so what is the significance that God provides? Fulfill his will. What else?
Bring others to him.
Well, it's the relationship with God, right? It's we're going to be in communion. In fact, how's the relationship characterized in the Bible? What is he to us? Father. Boy, my Socratic method's not working this morning.
Father.
But it's a relationship with him that gives it significance. Now, value is referring to your moral values. If there's no immortality, and if there's no God, there is no value, there's no moral judgment. And that's the remarkable thing. Remember the Wormbrandt quote in fact, I've got it. I'll just read it because I'm like that. I'm one of them guys. He was a prisoner under the communists, and he went and he founded Voice of the Martyrs up in Bartlesville. And he has a story that, of course, I can't find now. Crap. Well, I shared it with you last time. It's where the guard is telling him, I thank God in whom I do not believe, that the world is the way it is, because I can do what I want to you prisoners. And he did. And that was the evil of it. Because there's no judgment. It's not like he's got to pay for it. Because he's a communist, a Marxist. There is no immortality, certainly no God. And so there'll be no payback. So without immortality, there's no moral accountability. So ultimate payback. But without God, all moral values are mere delusions. How do we decide what is good? We have this absurd situation now in our culture where to oppose the current wokeness in whatever fashion you want is wrong. Well, I'm sorry, how do you know it's wrong? It's a decision. because there's no God to provide that. You don't believe in a God. So not all like that, but for this argument, lots don't. So where does right and wrong come from? God gives it. Well, it comes from us, social contract. Oh, so what the Nazis did was fine. Where do you get that? No, what they were wrong. No, they were all in agreement. In Germany, it was okay. Have you ever been to Dachau? I've been to Dachau. It's in Munich. It's in the middle of a suburb. Concentration camp suburb. Even 40 years ago, there was a suburb there. 6 years ago, whatever it is. And there's just a line of trees, not a forest, a line of trees that separate the camp from the families. It's just right there. And they were in agreement with this. We decided these people, gypsies, homosexuals, and Jews need to die. That's what we're going to do. And we say that's wrong. We call people, no, on what basis do you say it's wrong? If there's no God, there's no ultimate source to provide us with right and wrong. And that's a big, big deal. And in ethics, that's the current thing. If we have an evolutionary viewpoint of the origin of life and a materialistic view where there is no God, where do we get our ethics from? Big debate. And the conclusion is we have no place to get them. There's other than social contract. Just means, well, okay, so the Nazis were right. Now we're bigger than they are, and we say they're wrong. But somebody else will come along and say we're wrong. If we don't understand, it just makes sense to understand what that's profound. And without God, there's no purpose. If you're going to die, whether you die 50 years from now or 6 hours from now, ultimately it doesn't matter. If you're not immortal. But even if you are immortal, God's the only thing that can give us. What's the point of existence? You're back to the guy on the rock, on the moon rock. He says, I can live forever, but not necessarily something I want. And so what we're doing here is discussing, have you thought through what atheism sounds like, what it's like? And I want to do it out of this book, I think. Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize winning physicist, wrote a book called The First 3 Minutes, what the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang were. And he has this 2 paragraphs, I'm going to read them at the end of the book. However, all these problems may be solved, and whichever cosmological model proves correct, there's not much comfort in any of this. It is almost irresistible for humans to for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not just a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, but that somehow we were built in from the beginning. It is very hard to realize that this is all just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. It is even harder to realize that this present universe has evolved from an unspeakably unfamiliar early condition and faces a future extinction of endless cold or intolerable heat. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But if there's no solace in the fruits of our research, there is at least some consolation in the research itself. Men and women are not content to comfort themselves with tales of gods and giants or to confine their thoughts to the daily affairs of life. They also build telescopes and satellites and accelerators and sit at their desks for endless hours working out the meaning of the data they gather. The effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy. That's the closing line of the book. Tragedy is an evaluative stance. Where do you get that? You've just gone to great lengths to point out there's no God here. So why is it tragedy? Who gets to say it's tragedy? You're imposing that on that because that's all you can do. Otherwise, you're faced with this, the absurdity of it. So you can't live happily or consistently with atheistic worldview. If you're going to be happy, you're going to be inconsistent. If you're going to be consistent, you're going to be unhappy. What does it mean? You end up doing this. Look at this guy did. You impose a value. That's not, if you're consistent, then you're all the farcical, all that language you use, that's what you're forced with. If you're happy, then you're making up values. You've all heard of Richard Dawkins. And he's a staunch materialist, atheist, there is no God, blah, blah, blah. But he's a strict moralist. He made up his own 10 commandments to go with his worldview. But he gets asked this in debates. I haven't heard his answer. But on what basis do you do that? And who says you're right? I say you're wrong. Now what do we do? How do we solve this? Doesn't matter what you're saying. I just say you're wrong. How do we solve this? Might, and I didn't prove anything. If you do the second, then you end up like the existentialists, and just life is despair. The akin to this is I remember watching a speech by a guy on population, and he was saying the too much population, and we need to thin the herd. In essence, we need to screen out a lot of humans. I so badly wanted to say, are you volunteering? You won't be volunteer. You won't volunteer. No, I'm too important. No, we don't think you are. I think we'll start with you. The positions that people take. So biblical Christianity challenges all that. Because we say there is a God and there's life doesn't end. There is in fact immortality. By the way, you do know the Christian positions, everybody lives forever, right? Even the lost get immortality. It's not an immortality we want, akin to the guy on the rock, but it's the immortality they get. We can talk about that another time. There is God, there is immortality, and we invite you to a relationship with God. And that's what gives us a framework in which we can be happy. Blaise Pascal's solution to this was his famous wager. You've heard this? Look, either God exists or he doesn't. And that's a roughly 50-50 shot. You can't say he doesn't, because there's lots of evidence that he does. So just call it roughly even. And if it's a roughly even wager, why would you not choose God? Because if you say God exists and he doesn't, what have you lost? But if you say God exists and he does, yeah, well, look what you get. You know, now there's a bunch of other stuff involved with that, but you see the point. What about on the flip side? If you say God doesn't exist and he doesn't, you haven't really gained anything. If you say God doesn't exist and he does, well, then you've lost a lot. Because the only rational decision is to choose God. That's the famous Pascal wager. And by the way, he invented probability theory. So of course he went with wager. It's a interesting idea. So my question is, what do you guys think about the absurdity of no God, or do you disagree? I mean, you've heard the presentation. What do you think? What are your reactions? Nothing. We're blinking. It's Sunday morning. I wanted donuts. There are no donuts.
They're not coming?
Apparently not.
We wait longer than you know. Are you, so are you asking, what do we think about atheism, or are you asking?
I just the reaction to any of this.
I mean, being a science teacher.
Okay.
In the scientific community, I have a lot of friends who are atheists and dig in to atheism. And these are conversations that I try to have on the regular. It's something that I teach in my class. You don't have to choose science over God. It's not you don't have to choose one or the other. You can do both. And I think that the scientific community, there's so many people who are trying to prove the disexistence of God, but they've got their minds closed off to the existence. And I think that in my career, many times as a Christian scientist, I haven't put down. In fact, I've had bosses that said, "Oh, you can never be a high school science teacher because you're a Christian," and that automatically
Disqualifies.
It disqualifies you.
All right.
And he was a Buddhist, so he wasn't an atheist when he said that. But I mean, it's a battle that I fight on the regular.
Now, you in your presentation or presenting of what you just said, the war between science and God doesn't have to be.
No.
And that's actually a second step. And you're right, of course, and we will address that. But it's the previous step, which is take your Buddhist friend. Have you thought about what life without, because Buddhism doesn't believe in God. You know that, right? It's a godless religion. It's the great, you can get reunited with everything. Some Buddhists do, but as a rule, it's an atheistic religion. To get people to realize the corner they back themselves into is revelatory to them. And it's usually, since you're not attacking their thoughts, it's actually a conversation that can take place. Well, what would life without God be? What gives your life significance? Well, so what? I mean, we're all going to disappear. So what significance is that?
It's a little harder with the Buddhists because they believe in reincarnation. And so they believe that their purpose and their significance in life is to be reincarnated into a better existence.
But that has an endpoint,
Right.
which is the mokra, to be reunited to the one. So when you reach that, what? You cease to exist as an individual and you get absorbed. Really, that seems like bliss to you. But let's deal with the non-Buddhists, the strictly atheist scientists. The ramifications of that. Do you run into it, Jeff?
Not as much as what she's describing. But when I came up through SNU, I wasn't exposed to the public science.
Well, I guess the big argument becomes, I mean, the Bible wasn't a scientific document. I mean, all the discoveries we made in the last 100 years, you can't explain all that in the Bible and people understand it. It's not, like I said, even when you talk about Adam and Eve, there was a population there. I mean, if you read it, you got to understand there was a pretty good population there. And so to take the Bible literal there, it couldn't explain scientifically what went on.
Well, again, this is prior to that, though.
What it was trying to do.
The point of this discussion is prior to any discussion like that. That's I wanted to see that. Bible doesn't enter into it. We're not talking about the Bible. Just what are the ramifications of an atheistic worldview? And that's all you do. So you don't have to defend the Bible. It's immaterial. And just theistic worldview versus an atheistic worldview. Kind of the Blaise Pascal event. But if you're truly an atheist, let's think that through. What are we going to see? So what are how are you going to say something's right or wrong? That sort of discussion, which we love to do. I mean, that's what cancel culture is, right? You're wrong. The reaction against cancel culture, they're wrong. Oh, those are value judgments. On what basis are we establishing these values? It can't be social cohesion because we're disagreeing. You have your set and I have my set. And if it's just social cohesion, fine. You have your truth, I have mine, sort of stuff. But you're seeking to, one's trying to impose it on the other. And so how do we do that? And why do we do that? On what basis do you do that? And people don't like facing that. No, that can't be. So in fact, let me read something. You end up all right. All right, now let me just read something to you. Confronted with this dilemma, modern man flounders pathetically for some means of escape. In a remarkable address to the American Academy for the Advancement of Science in 1991, Dr. L.D. Roux, confronted with the predicament of modern man, boldly advocated that we deceive ourselves. He's advocating that we deceive ourselves by means of some noble lie, his term, into thinking that we and the universe still has value. According to Roux, quote, the lesson of the past 2 centuries is that intellectual and moral relativism is profoundly the case. He's saying that's clear. He says the consequence of this realization is that the quest for self-fulfillment and the quest for social coherence fall apart. This is because on the view of relativism, the search for self-fulfillment becomes radically privatized. Each person chooses his own set of values and meanings. No social cohesion in that. So what are we to do? Roux says there's, on the one hand, the madhouse option. We just pursue self-fulfillment regardless of social coherence. On the other hand, there's the totalitarian option. The state imposes social coherence at the expense of people's personal fulfillment. If we're to avoid these 2 options, he says, then we have no choice but to embrace some noble lie that will inspire us to live beyond selfish interests and so voluntarily achieve social coherence. A noble lie is, quote, one that deceives us, tricks us, compels us beyond self-interest, beyond ego, beyond family, nation, race. It is a lie because it tells us that the universe is infused with value, which is a great fiction. Because it makes a claim to universal truth when there is none. And it's a lie because it tells me not to live for self-interest, which is evidently false. But without such lies, we cannot live. Let's give an example of this. The lockdowns. After a while, people said, I don't care. I am not going to agree to this. I'm not wearing a mask. And what was the response? Bringing the power of the state down on us. Your only options, if you're not going to buy into this and you're going to pursue self-fulfillment, then the state has to clamp down. Otherwise, you voluntarily submit to it. That's how it works out. And we're on the cusp of this in more than one area in our culture. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. You read these guys. As you know, I'm reading several books as we go through this. I'm doing one called The Return of the God Hypothesis. It's becoming more and more. There are lots of scientists who are saying we can't avoid a theistic worldview. You just can't. The universe has a beginning and it didn't create itself. So something's got to explain that. And so that's ultimately what it boils down to. And so there are all kinds of stuff. How certain factors had to be just so for life to be on the planet and all this stuff. And so they're not necessarily landing on the Christian God, but the idea of a theistic explanation just holds more and more credibility. It is at the point now that your boss would be wrong. The current it is a valid scientific approach to have a theistic worldview. It just is. Can't prove it. We do realize you can't prove the existence of God, right? Or every rational human being on the planet would believe it. Because most people aren't going to go against their self-interest. But what is my response to that? How many times have you heard me say this? People want to sleep with their secretaries, and they will go to great lengths to eliminate the idea that somebody can tell me what to do, because I want to sleep with my secretary, which is shorthand. I want to do what I want. You're not the boss of me. You don't want to sleep with your secretary?
I don't remember hearing you talk about that before.
Oh, I usually say it every week.
Let's read it.
Yeah.
Oh, we weren't.
Ah,
I got missed every Sunday that you.
that's a quote from T.H. Huxley, who was a biologist who went with, which instrumental in making Darwinism popular at the end of the 1800s.
I have a similar statement that I would be the last in the line. Everybody wants to be high.
There's and that feeds into what we're talking about today, because people want to get away from the absurdity of it all. So they want to be high. It's a good reaction. I mean, that's a good observation. All right. So try that conversation again. All you're doing is just, well, if you believe this, where does that lead? You don't even have to challenge it. Let's just say you're right. What follows from that? And is that a world I want to live in? Well, it's not like you have a choice. Well, actually, you do. And that's why they make it like, it's amazing that guy after guy points out the absurdity of the planet. Camus was famous for this. The existentialist, staunch anti-Nazi, staunch anti-totalitarian. Said, no. People go, on what basis are you making that conclusion? And he got castigated for it. If you're going to be an existentialist, you have no basis for making that judgment. But no, because people won't live that way. You just won't.
So how do you argue? So here's a conversation that I've had with an atheist friend. When I tried the whole, well, how do you have morals? Where do morals come from if God doesn't exist? How do we know right versus wrong? And their argument is because we have evolved to a more intelligent, higher level species, and it's not really the fact that there's a God giving us right or wrong, it's that our brain has a higher capacity to determine these things.
The follow-up to that is, does everybody agree on what those are? That's how you handle that. Yeah, okay, you're absolutely right. We are smarter and we think, now, do you agree with me on all morals? Well, most of them, but not all of them, do you? Now, how are we going to solve that?
Well, their argument would be that even Christians don't agree on all
Now,
that.
brilliant point. So you can't arrive there by reason.
I mean,
Go ahead.
obviously Nazis didn't have the same, not that they were all atheists, because they weren't, but even if you just say that, they have a different moral standard than, everybody else was appalled, but they thought it was okay.
Or the Al-Qaeda. So we're saying they're right? Well, no, they're wrong. On what basis are you saying it's wrong? Well, we could reason that. No, we can't, because not every one of those is a knuckle-dragging cave dweller. There are smart people there, and they disagree with you. So that's how you handle that. If we can't agree, and we don't agree. You don't even agree with me now, smart person. And I'm assuming you're assuming I'm smart. If not, then that's a separate issue. But there are smart people that advocate what I'm advocating. And that's how you do that. That's all you can do. And you point that out. And they'll dig in often, but you can make them think. That's all you can do. Yeah, people don't change their mind because they lose an argument. Remember that. But you can present stuff and make them think.
That's why I like the Pascal.
To To me, at the end of the day, that's what it comes down. to. I mean, how can they argue that? So one of us, if one of us is wrong, can't both be right. So if one of us is wrong, what's the outcome?
Right.
I've used that multiple times, and it usually ends the conversation.
It,
Yeah, to me, that's hard to argue more than anything else.
but there, in fact, we can present some positive viewpoints. But when we're done with all this, we're still not gonna be able to prove that God exists. But we can show that it's rational and may even be able to demonstrate it's the more likely.
There are, I mentioned him and PragerU a lot, so people probably get tired of hearing it. There are a couple of really great PragerU videos that show the need for a God to support homes.
Yeah.
I mean, really great videos, and they're about 5 minutes each, and I think they're very cool. But Dennis Prager is fond of asking people, I keep thinking back to that, he likes to ask people, well, forgetting about whether you believe there's a God or not, what do you want to be true? Do you want there to be a God, or do you don't? You want there to be no God?
Right.
I think that's an interesting thing to get people to answer also.
If they're honest, they'll say, I don't want a God, because I want to sleep with my secretary. It comes down to sleeping with the secretary. It really does. By the way, William Lane Craig, lots of videos. You can see debates with Dawkins if you want. It's worth the time. Those are fun. There's lots of stuff online. You're aware of that. All right. So next time we're going to talk about God. Not like we didn't today, but we're going to do more of that.